India's trade with China is important because for the last 15 years, China has been India's top source of imports. Now, to take a closer look at India's intriguing trade ties with China, we have with us Michael Kugelman, South Asia Institute Director at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much, Mr. Kugelman, for joining us on NDTV. We've just heard the Foreign Minister say the world will come to India, not because India is a China plus one, but because India has the capacities and the capability as well as international credibility. Is there now a certain sense of pessimism about China's economic prospects? Do you think India seems to have become the new destination for capital and technology flow?
Well, look what just happened with India recently. India recently staged a lunar landing on the south pole of the moon. No country has done that successfully before. So I think that's a nice reflection of the type of technological and scientific capacities that India has. But indeed, more broadly, this is a moment when we have a number of major companies, particularly tech companies, that are increasingly concerned about basing production in other facilities in China and are indeed looking to pivot to India. So India certainly has an opportunity, and in the case of a company like Apple, India showed that it has that ability to drive some of these major global tech firms away from China and over to India. Certainly it has a lot of work still to do, but we're starting to see some signs of success already.
Right, there's no denying that China has made impressive progress on some technologies that can replace labor. But if you have a look at the total factor productivity, which includes labor and capital, it has been declining for China. Isn't it far from clear whether tightening party and state control of the private sector will help solve this problem?
Well, look, we know that China has managed to enjoy significant levels of economic success despite being a closed society and authoritarian state for so many years. And, its economy continues to be strong. It has experienced some slowdowns, looking at some slumping in the real estate sector, for example. But, the economy remains strong. But, I do think that, recent developments in China have, I think, made India a much more attractive partner. But, pardon me, let me rephrase that. Recent developments in China have made India seem like a more attractive destination for many major Western companies and companies from around the world. But let's also be very clear. I think that India is really a winner here from great power competition, and particularly U.S.-China competition. You have a lot of major companies and entities from the West that are increasingly uncomfortable engaging with China and wanting to really engage more with India, which I would argue that many countries and many companies in the West view as a key player in this broadening effort to try to counter Chinese power, including Chinese economic power.
In fact, Mr. Kugelman, Minister of State for Electronics and IT, Rajiv Chandrasekhar, had said the government welcomed investment from China, and trade with China boomed to record levels in 2020 and 2021, led by imports of Chinese machinery. Now, at the same time, the Indian government has banned more than 200 Chinese apps, including TikTok. How does one decipher this relationship?
I think you've hit on an important point. It really is not realistic to think that India and many other countries around the world, including the U.S., can decouple themselves economically from China. China is such a critical trade and investment partner for so many countries, including countries that see themselves as competitors and rivals to China. And indeed, you're right that India has banned dozens, hundreds of Chinese apps, and of course this pattern started after that terrible border clash 3 years ago. But that's pretty much it. We have not seen other efforts on the part of New Delhi to try to punish the Chinese economy and to try to distance India from the Chinese economy. And indeed, if you look at trade figures for the last year, we see that China continues to be one of India's top trade partners. I think you could also look at that as as a very useful model to show that countries that are competitors and rivals and have fought wars against each other and have border clashes, they could still manage to find ways to get along through some degrees of commercial cooperation, which is happening with China and India. And, we've also seen that though it causes tension sometimes, China and India are able to coexist within a number of multilateral organizations, whether you're talking about the BRICS, or you're talking about the G20, or you're talking about the SCO. So it's a very complex relationship for sure. But for me, how I see it is that despite strategic competition, despite security tensions, despite mistrust, the two countries find ways to get along enough that they could engage in trade and cooperate commercially, which has really, I think, create a lot of benefits and advantages for both countries.
Just picking up on what you touched upon, Beijing has sought to enhance the world's dependence on its economy and also leverage it for strategic benefit. But for many, it may be tempting to claim that the end of China's growth miracle has begun. What's your take? Can countries afford to decouple from China?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to count China out, so to speak. This is a country, I would argue, that's been able to defy a lot of predictions about its impending slowdown or demise as a strong economy. It continues to be front and center on the global economic stage. Now, certainly you could look to some major challenges that China is going to face, such as its demographics and aging population, which raises questions about labor economy and the number of workers in the coming years. These are things that certainly have to be worked out, and obviously the authoritarian state that China has been for so long, I think inhibits certain types of economic policies, such as more liberalization, that could help make the economy more resilient. But I think that it's way too early to be talking about the end of the Chinese economic story, economic miracle, whatever you want to call it. I go back to what I said before. I don't really think there's any country in the world that is seriously entertaining the idea of decoupling itself economically from China. It's just not possible to do, given how entrenched it is, how much clout it has in the investment and the trade context. And you look at these new and emerging technologies that have become so critical for the global economy, like semiconductors. Well, China is right out there, a really big player in that. So I really think that it would be premature to count China out as an economic player and a key economic player. That will continue for quite some time, I believe.
Thank you so much, Michael Kugelman, for joining us on NDTV.